after this many years, despite fears and claims otherwise, giving out naloxone does not increase drug use. It just increases the likelihood that someone will survive a lethal dose of opioids. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Greg Bohl to talk about some of our work with first responder agencies across Missouri.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to be drawing your attention to two handouts today. One is the green and yellow handout that says MIMH First Responder Team, and the other one is the red and white that refers to Springfield Fire Department's programming, partnering with us. My name is Greg Bohl. I work for Dr. Winograd here as the First Responder Program Coordinator here at the Missouri Institute of Mental Health's Addiction Science Team. My background is I spent 10 years on active duty in the U.S. Army, most of which was spent as a medic in Special Operations Command. And then for the past 24 months, I've worked here on this team, and I am a qualified Missouri paramedic as well. So the program that we do for the first responders in the state of Missouri, we provide training, equipment, and technical assistance to the first responder agencies, and we serve statewide. Primarily what the supplying with the equipment looks like is we provide the first responder agencies with naloxone, generally brand name Narcan, to administer on patients, and perhaps more importantly, leave behind Narcan bags, these blue bags that are represented amongst you, in order to provide this additional level of care and make it much less likely that somebody will overdose in the future in a way that's lethal. And what we've found with this programming, the bottom line up front before I get into the details of it, is that it's not just good for the people in the community that are struggling with addiction or struggling with substance use. It's also incredibly beneficial for our first responders as well. Probably no one in Missouri has been more harder impacted by the overdose crisis than the first responders themselves, who have to respond to these overdoses sometimes on a daily or even sometimes on an hourly basis. And by giving them this extra tool in their tool belt, we've allowed them to lighten their burden substantially, and we've received tremendous feedback. So through this training, equipment, and technical assistance, we have three main effects that we are trying to achieve. First is we're trying to increase the first responders' ability to save lives by not only giving them naloxone to carry and administer, but also instilling in them the confidence that naloxone is very safe to administer and that they're not going to make any situation worse. You know, it's one thing for a seasoned paramedic to respond to an overdose who really knows what they're doing and has been there before. It's quite another thing for a 19-year-old volunteer firefighter or a brand new police officer fresh out of the academy to respond to a medical emergency. And when they understand that naloxone really is the safest medication there is, that they can't make anybody worse by administering it, and that they wouldn't be punished in any sort of legal capacity or sued in any way by administering it, it really gives them the confidence they need to tackle those situations with vigor and save lives confidently. The second effect that we hope to achieve with this programming, and we are achieving, is that we're reducing the workload on first responders by, frankly, giving them less to do. First responders tend to be the people who pick up the slack whenever anything fails in a society. And what's great about this is that through things like leave behind naloxone and then rapid access to addiction treatment and medications that can help these individuals, we make it much less likely, for them to overdose again, so our first responders won't have to respond to a second overdose on these individuals. And secondly, by obtaining access to buprenorphine or methadone or other forms of resources, makes it much less likely that these individuals will be committing crimes or be going jobless or be going homeless long term, so that these individuals won't have to be having frequent interactions with law enforcement or other first responders long term. So it's great for everybody involved there. And then finally, not only do we want first responders to have less to do, but we want them to be dealing with less stress and frustration and burnout and physical risk when they do have to respond to these calls. So the way that we've been able to accomplish that is by giving first responders accurate information about the level of threat that fentanyl actually presents to first responders on a scene, and also give them accurate information about the risk of combativeness when a patient has received a dose of naloxone. There's a lot of really bad information out there, primarily driven by YouTube and things like that, that would have you believe that powdered fentanyl is this weapon of mass destruction, that like mustard gas, where if you're in the same room as it, you'll surely perish. And that's simply not accurate. Certainly, if you get powdered fentanyl on your hands and then were to like rub it into your mouth or into your nose, that could be a problem for you. But simply grazing powdered fentanyl with your hands or being in the same room as it is not a lethal threat to anyone. And the more that our first responders understand this, the more confident they can be and the much less likely they are to carry an unnecessary burden of stress. And then secondly, there's this one is not as false, but it's certainly an exaggeration, the idea of the combative Narcan patient, that if you give naloxone to somebody who's overdosed, they're going to come up fighting. That's true an extremely small percentage of the time and can very easily be mitigated by only giving them as much naloxone as they actually need. You don't want to give them 10 times the amount of naloxone that they need because, as this chart shows, each dose of naloxone would send somebody further and further down into the red zone. So by giving them one and then rescue breathing for them or bagging them, depending on their level of medical credential, you're going to make it much less likely that the person's going to have an adverse reaction. And then secondly, using proper de-escalation techniques, which is obviously something that we need all our first responders to be gifted at, by being able to talk to a person in a calm voice, by giving them physical space, and by knowing the right things to say as the person is coming out of this overdose, they can make it much less likely for somebody to have an aggressive reaction to receiving the dose of Narcan. And I want to call your attention to one particular quote underneath the reducing first responder stress. This was from one of our paramedic agencies who we trained recently, and he reported to us, one of these paramedics who was self-identified as a, quote, salty medic. He's been in this game for a very long time, and he had developed certain feelings about overdose calls and was frankly, not thrilled about responding to them. But he said to us, I was skeptical about this new training at first, but when I tried out these de-escalation techniques as the person started to wake up, it was actually the smoothest overdose of my career. A gentleman, came out of the overdose much calmer because he knew the right things to say and the way to be less intimidating and threatening, and it ended up resulting in the patient getting handed off to the EPIC Project, who is one of our partner agencies that we encourage first responders to refer people struggling with addiction to. So just we've supplied about almost 20,000 doses of Narcan, naloxone, both in the form for the first responders to carry and also the leave behind bags in the past year to first responder agencies. And I could go on and on about any of the hundreds of agencies that we work with, but I wanted to highlight just one successful case study. This printout is from Springfield Fire Department. This is their work, and they talk about they've been doing leave behind naloxone for about a year, and they have seen an absolutely precipitous drop in their overdose call volume as a fire department in that year that they've been distributing leave behind. And on the back here, you can see down here on this chart on the bottom, they've